Yes, if you can. Uh, Thank you, Alex. For Can everyone hear me? Okay, there was a slight delay on my you are muted Zoom feature. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, and so the panelists can get a flavor for where everybody's coming from. And I know we'll have some guests today from local foundations that are working with our NNIP partners, so a special welcome to them. All right, I think we'll probably have some more folks join, but in the interest of moving us on to the discussion, I'm going to get started. So welcome to our final panel of NNIP Month. What does this moment require? Perspectives from philanthropy. I'm excited to have all of our panelists join us and to learn about and have them reflect on some trends in philanthropy and where they have been on their journey in the last year. Just to start out with, I know we have some folks who are less familiar with NNIP joining us, and your local NNIP partner or organization that does community data work may look a little bit different from place to place, but we all share a mission to ensure that communities have access to data and the skills to use information to advance equity and well-being across neighborhoods. Just a few housekeeping notes for our NNIP folks online. Final reminders for NNIP month as we close out the month. I hope you were all able to meet with your buddy for Buddy Coffee. Please mail your t-shirt if you haven't already in the t-shirt exchange. And join us tomorrow for our final lunch and a small group networking, either at 1 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And I want to introduce our moderator for today, Faith Mitchell, my colleague here at the Urban Institute. She joined us from Grantmakers in Health, where she served as president and CEO, and is now working with both our Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and our Health Policy Center, and a project at Urban on America's Transformation, which will look at the implications and possibilities of this country's racial and ethnic evolution. Over several decades, her career has bridged research, practice, and social and health policy. So Faith, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Leah. I'm really pleased that everybody has joined us today. And we're going to start. I'm going to make a few opening remarks, and then I will turn to our panelists and introduce them. But as you know, the title of the session is, what does this moment require? So I started by Googling 2020 a few minutes ago. I was like, what are people saying about 2020? Is there like a cool phrase or something that I can use in mixed company? You know, there's a lot of language out there, but I ended up with the adjective unprecedented, which I think we can all agree with. It was an unprecedented year. We had the global pandemic with disastrous implications for women and low-income workers and low-income communities. We had the movement for racial justice, whose one-year anniversary we're observing this week. So that was a very positive development of last year that raised some difficult issues that we have avoided dealing with for a very long time. We had deeply disturbing and ongoing challenges to our democratic processes as part of 2020. And then we had climate change, another thing that didn't get necessarily a whole lot of discussion last year, more discussion this year, but also with implications for equity and communities. So there were a lot of challenges that arose. Uh, on the other hand, we also saw new energy in the philanthropic sector to address these multiple challenges. And in some cases, there have been major changes that were made among funders. And so that's the purpose of the panel today, is to kind of explore some of these issues, to find out more about what grant makers have been doing. And we have this wonderful panel who will discuss this today. We have Colleen Briggs, who's the head of Inclusive Economies, Financial Health and Community Development at JP Morgan Chase and Company. We have my old buddy, Mark Constantine, who's president and CEO of the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation in Richmond, Virginia, and Chantel Rush, who's managing director of the American Cities Program at the Kresge Foundation. So 2 national funders and a local funder. And what we're going to do is for about 5 minutes each of the panelists will make an opening statement, a kind of $30,000 statement that talks about the session, and they'll talk about what their respective institutions have been doing recently. Then for about 15 minutes, I'll ask them some questions so that we can dig a little bit deeper, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions. So you can put your questions in the chat, and for the last 20 minutes or so, I'll just read them out and get their responses. So with that, let's get going, and we will turn first to Colleen.
Thank you so much, Faith, and thank you all for letting us join this conversation today. I mean, unprecedented is definitely one way to describe the last year. I think as we sort of, I personally look back at the last year, I think I've been reflecting a lot that we all know the pandemic really exacerbated longstanding inequities that many of us and many of you all have been studying for most of our careers. But I think it also accelerated our collective awareness of racial injustice and inequity for maybe those who weren't part of the conversation previously. And I think it's been a particularly moment of reckoning for philanthropy. And we've seen philanthropy increasingly understand the importance of leadership in this moment, and that their actions really have to go beyond words, and that for us to tackle structural problems like those that we have been under a spotlight over the last year, it's going to require structural solutions and a different way of thinking of how you're going to tackle that. And I think central to this conversation, data is going to be really central to that. If harnessed the right way, which I know we're going to talk about more, it can help us sort of diagnose those inequities, mobilize action, and create sort of a shared vision for where we go. I think it can bring in new partnerships and help us track progress. And I think that's sort of how we've seen, even within JP Morgan Chase, where data has been helping us on our journey, not only sort of deepening our understanding of the problem, but also helping us understand where to go and how to really track our progress. And so, if we go back sort of a year ago, we were already on this journey, but I would say it accelerated over the last year. And we started by listening. We went out and talked to hundreds of community partners, leading experts. We dug into the data, both internal and external, to really understand how our hiring of products, practices, and services created barriers and actually exacerbated maybe some of those inequities that we were seeing. And that's what led to the development of our $30 billion commitment to racial equity. And that spans everything from our procurement to our hiring, to our products and services. About 2 billion of it is philanthropy, but I think that's really important, that the majority of it is really changing all of the assets of our firm and thinking about, how we think about incremental commitments. This was all new commitments. This is not BAU package. This was new, really changing how we do business. And I think really important part of this was the accountability that came with that. And I think that's where data plays another really important role, was making sure we had the right data to track our progress. Someone might be opening a bank account, but are they using it? Are they saving? Are they building credit? We needed that deeper level of data to understand, are we actually addressing understanding the right problems, and are we addressing those problems and making progress against them? I think it's also been really critical for us that this is ongoing. We made this commitment, but for us, and when you think about implementation, it's iterative. We're trying to take the data that we're hearing, the feedback we hear in communities, and continually refine and push ourselves because we know this is not going to be a static moment. This is something we're going to have to continually evolve and push ourselves. I think we've also learned it has to be hyper-local, which is another really interesting insight as we think about the role that you all play, is that these solutions need to be tailored to the unique circumstances of different communities. And I think really ensuring that sort of these national initiatives really are reflecting and responsive to the needs on the ground is going to be really critical. And then finally, I know we'll talk about this more, but it's really pushed us to think about the enabling environment, and in particular policy. And I think understanding how we can do only so much on the philanthropy and corporate side, but it is also critical for us to weigh in with our voice around addressing some of these policies that are maybe inhibiting progress around these goals. And so that's kind of been the journey that we've been on over the last year, but I would say it's definitely ongoing and something that we're continually working on, and excited for the conversation to dig in more.
Terrific, thank you. We're just going to go in alphabetical order, so turn to Mark now.
Thanks, Faith. And I'm going to riff off you, Colleen. RMHF, unlike the other funders on this call, we are hyper local. We're only about 75 million in assets. So, and we work in Richmond City and 5 surrounding counties. And we, like JP Morgan Chase and Kresge, have been on a racial equity journey for the last 5 years. We started in 2016 and very explicitly began working with Glenn Harris from Race Forward and Gladys Washington, who had been at the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, to center our work squarely in health and racial equity. So that's first and foremost. Exactly what Colleen said. I think what we have learned is that the profound health disparities for Black and Brown communities has been so exacerbated by this period. And so it's something that our trustees and team and our community are looking at profoundly differently. Colleen, I was glad that you talked about health and wealth. And I will talk more about this, Faith, when we talk, but we have begun to make our first investments in policy and advocacy around EITC and the guaranteed income pilot, because we think that for Black and Brown folks and for women who have been so disenfranchised, that this is a moment that we need to change. Philanthropy, I have been somewhat encouraged, Colleen, by this period. You say it's been a day of reckoning, and absolutely it has. I think what it has done is hold us accountable in profoundly new ways. And so again, I'll talk more about this, but there's been 7 local funders in Richmond who have been meeting with Glenn Harris and others to think about how we apply health and racial equity to all that we do. We are, the foundation, are going to try to pivot almost exclusively to general operating grants, because we've understood in this period we cannot ask our nonprofit partners to go through more hoops. And one of the more popular things that we've done, we've eliminated final reporting, that written reports. So our team is now interviewing everyone. I'll talk more about some efforts, but we've explicitly are developing the capacity of Black and Brown grassroots organizations. We are more explicitly linking community organizations led by people of color accountable to their communities with our statewide policy and advocacy organizations. We are having much more explicit conversations around power building and community organizing, because I think what this moment has taught us is that we need folks with power, voice, access, and resources to really move the needle around health equity and racial equity. I will stop there, Faith, in the interest of time, and then we can come back to whatever y'all want to talk about.
Great, thank you. Chantel?
Thank you. So for us, I think Faith was explaining what the last year has felt like. We were moving from COVID and the associated fallout from COVID to the heightening moment and movement in the racial justice space, to equitable vaccine distribution, and now we're looking at the American Rescue Plan. And so it's been sort of a whirlwind, and things where it feels like, you know, a decade has happened in the last year. I think for us, the first change really happened when COVID started running rampant in our focus cities, and recognizing that people who were employed, people who had, you know, managed to eke out a precarious existence, were without food, without money to pay for housing, without money to pay for utilities, didn't have the ability to get their kids to virtual school. That happened so quickly. And it made you recognize kind of the level of precariousness that existed before COVID. And it made you think about, what were we really doing in our work to support folks when it came to economic insecurity, when it came to food security? Where, national funders and organizations can be so focused on systems change, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when we're working with people who are, extremely low income, are we considering those challenges? It also made us think, the moment made us think about the who we fund. With the heightening of the racial justice movement, the activists and activism made it very clear that that was going to be necessary to make change in the country. And we started becoming more aware than ever that our work needed to support these organizers and these activists, and that we had to move beyond seeking equality where people have the same supports, and even beyond equity where people have different supports, to really the goal of justice. And what could our work do to support people who are working in the justice space? And then finally, I'll just say, it wasn't just about, taking on new issue areas like economic insecurity. It wasn't just about supporting civil rights and racial justice organizers. It also became really, for us, a reckoning moment in terms of who we fund and how close they are to the ground, and recognizing the need to support proximate leadership, and understanding that people who are closest to the community are closest to the problems at hand. They're also closer to the issue areas, closer to the solutions, and often can be very effective advocates for change at a systems level. So how could we shift dollars to those communities and to people in community closer to the ground? So we're thinking a lot more now about proximate leadership and how we advocate for our dollars to support leaders who are very proximate to their communities going forward. We're thinking a lot about how do you move the needle given these considerations, given this moment. And I think we'll talk more about that through the rest of the panel. But it is clear that the work that NNIP does is extremely important, because without data, we can't rightfully diagnose these issues. We can't rightfully hold ourselves accountable for having impact in these spaces. And, we wouldn't be able to highlight some of the key areas where we need to focus moving forward.
Thanks, everybody. Those are terrific. Give us a lot to think about and to ask about. And I want to start with my next question by asking you, everybody referenced data. Are there things you would like to know more about? Is there data you don't have that you're beginning to feel like you need? Are you able to kind of describe that? Like we need to, I'm part of another project that is trying to design like what to support equity, what kind of public health data do we need that we don't have now? So it's on my mind. And I'm just wondering if you've had thoughts along those same lines in your work. Anybody?
Right, I'm happy to start. I was waiting to not always be the first one alphabetically, sort of you start a tone after you go first alphabetically. I would say our data wish list is very long, especially as we are going very deep in communities right now on trying to localize the $30 billion. It really helps highlight just the data gaps, particularly as we look at trying to get disaggregated data. And so we can really understand who's being excluded today, who's being overlooked, and I think as we've most foundations, data is core to what they're doing. And we're kind of lucky that we have the JP Chase Institute that does have some anonymized aggregated data that we can tap into. But I think even when we leverage that, we leverage our third-party researchers, I still think we're continuing to see some pretty significant gaps when it comes to making sure that we've got the right partners to engage at the local level to ensure that the data design and collection methods are equitable. Do we have the right context for the data? Are we even asking the right questions? Because I think we know if you don't get these components right, it can actually misdiagnose problems and actually worsen inequities because we're having interventions that don't actually reflect what's needed on the ground. So this sort of idea of community-based participatory research is very much top of mind for us, and thinking about how do we bring the community as part of this. And so not only is there some of the gaps on the quantitative side around really trying to get disaggregated by race, by ethnicity, by gender in markets, trying to get really hyper local, so that we can really understand, at a very local level where we're seeing these disparities play out. That's sort of on the quantitative side. But then I think also what's missing for us is the qualitative data, because I think that can sometimes be almost even more accurate in conveying the lived experience and the context, and can really create a very holistic view of what's happening in communities around understanding what problems we need to be addressing, and then tracking our progress over time. And so that's kind of where we've seen at least some of the gaps or challenges as we've been trying to implement some of our capital investments.
Great.
As a follow-up, a couple places that come immediately to mind. Actually, Faith, we're deeply interested in the American Rescue Plan and where that money's going. I think that's a question that we all have. But if there's an urgency right now, I think in Richmond, is we want to get a better handle on where that's going. I really liked what Chantel said about being folks who are proximate to issues. One of the challenges right now is the democratization of data. And so how are we able to sort of make sure the folks most affected, both leaders and folks in communities and neighborhoods, have the data? And so we have the big question of where's the money going, and then how are we going to get the money, that information, to other folks? I really like, Colleen, what you said about qualitative data. So we have a deep commitment to build capacity of Black and Brown grassroots organizations, because we have an assumption that we need their voice and power at the table. We need to get better handle on what they need, what, from us and from others, and what data they want at this moment. So I think listening really differently for funders is going to be key to what work that we do. Faith, I think we all have access to data. So Prosperity Now's data and JP Morgan's on wealth and the CDC's around disparities. But I think the biggest question that communities have is, with so much coming at us, how do we set the table for meaningful conversations that are not just conversations in the moment, but conversations that can be sustained over time? And how do we bring in more younger leaders as we work towards health and housing justice issues, not just the getting the money out the door in 2021 and 22, but creating a platform for long-term change and conversation?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that there's a lot of data, and there's been a lot of data for a long time on like community deficiencies, reading levels and, poverty rates and employment rates. And what we're kind of more interested in this moment, and I think what we're needing more of, is data on the abundance of resources that are flowing into communities and where is it really going. And, there's bank capital, there's CDFI capital, there's grant capital, there are federal resources. And do we really have a good sense of how those dollars are landing in under-resourced communities? And what would it really take to shift some of those capital flows? And I mean, there are folks at the Urban Institute, Brett Theodos, doing really great tracking around capital flows. But I think the more we can do this, and the more we can have that data available to folks leading local nonprofits, civic actors, government leaders, philanthropic leaders, the quicker we can figure out what our plan is going to be to actually get those resources to what have historically been under-resourced communities.
Great. Such rich answers. I love it. So I'm really struck listening to the stories of the three foundations. It went, certainly in the two cases, JP Morgan Chase and Richmond, it was clear that the sort of equity journey wasn't new, and that 2020 kind of just sharpened your sense of urgency. And even with Kresge, Chantel talked about a kind of shift, like from equity to justice and so forth. But I'm sure it wasn't like 180. I mean, you were already working on those issues, and it was more like a kind of a sharpened tone. And that might be, speaking of unprecedented, kind of unprecedented for philanthropy, and I think you think about how hard it often is to get foundations to kind of change, or for boards to support what CEOs and staff members know are important things to do. So each of your three stories is very kind of fantastic in that regard. I'm wondering if, given all those changes or modifications that you experienced over the last year, is there any area where you would want the foundation to push even harder? Is there sort of your list of work still undone or work to do over the next year or years? Any order you can.
I can jump in here. I think in the philanthropic sector in general, it's really easy to want to be a good citizen or to want to feel good about your grant making. And so to give a small amount of dollars to lots of geographies, to lots of different organizations, to, large national policy shops, large national intermediaries, smaller nonprofit, local nonprofits, et cetera. And you can kind of get in the habit of feeling really great, like you're covering everything and you're providing resources to everyone. But what we know is that to create change, we need more concentrated resources for a longer period of time that are more laser focused. And so I think one thing I'd like to see philanthropy do differently is figure out what we have to be a little bit more honest about what our specialty is within our foundation, what we can be most effective at, to put more of our dollars behind that problem, to actually hold ourselves accountable to seeing change, to making hard decisions, to get that work done. And then I think more distributed leadership across foundations. So, if our foundation isn't necessarily great at, say, election protection, how do we understand that and really leave it to and support other foundations that have more expertise in that space to do that work. We have to stop trying to make ourselves feel good by sending out a couple of dollars everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And Faith, for more of a small sort of community-based foundation, what are the challenges we're thinking about? I think there's a lot of important work that we're trying to do. With $500,000 from the CDC Foundation, we were able to leverage about another $1.5 million to support work around the undocumented Latino and Hispanic populations around COVID. We're trying to work very differently around the Black and Brown community-based organizations that we support. But it's going to require both, as Chantel rightly said, the long-term view, but finding other investors in our own community, healthcare systems, our local hospitals and academic institutions, working really differently with financial institutions, because the capital that we control relative to all these major actors is very small. And so how does philanthropy in a place like Richmond's not only create the table, join the table, but make sure that folks whose voices need to be there are at the table? And I think that's going to be a challenge that we face for the next 5 to 10 years. I think Chantel is right. This is a time for philanthropy to step up and make longer term sort of commitments to issues and realize that you can't do something in 1 or 2 years, and to recognize with precision sort of whose voice needs to be there, who's heard, where power and policy is where that decision-making authority, and who different partners will be to sustain the work.
I love all the points, so I will definitely second everything. I'd say sort of specifically for our institution, I think some of the areas that we're really still pushing on and still work to be done is, I think, going back to Chantel, some of the points you had made earlier, and Mark, around really examining who we fund and how we fund them. Groups like Mark and Chantel have been doing this for many years, but it's maybe sort of newer for us to really examine what type of funding that we're providing to BIPOC leaders, trying to be more flexible on funding, providing more infrastructure support. I think, Mark, I'm very envious of that you've gotten rid of end of grant term reporting. I feel like that's an aspiration. We're not there yet, but I think really trying to figure out what's the right data that we need to actually inform strategy and how do we reduce the burden. So I think, we're definitely, I would say, very much in the journey on that. And I think there's more that we need to be doing to really, set ambitious targets about who we're funding, and then really examine how we can be more equitable and how we disperse capital to BIPOC-led organizations. I think the other thing is examining our own institution. I think for us to advance this work externally, we have to really be committed to the work internally. And that means really spending a lot of time on our values and the populations that we represent, and making sure we have diverse voices really informing our strategies. So I think that's something we're just continuing on that journey as well. And then finally, just sort of second points that have been made, but I do think the more that we can continue to sort of address some of these sort of root causes and symptoms versus just, the symptoms of some of the issues that we've been seeing to date, and I think to Mark's point, philanthropy is small in the grand scheme of the systems where we operate. And so, how do we use philanthropy to de-risk innovation for markets, to maybe see market opportunities where they don't necessarily, or perceived risk is unfair today, or scaling solutions where the market fails through policy interventions. And I think, more that sort of I think we're on a journey of really trying to use our corporate voice to advocate for more of those. We just rolled out a pretty ambitious agenda around second chance policy, where not only are we changing sort of our own criminal, removing criminal background questions from our own hiring process, but also really pushing policymakers around the policy reforms that they need to make as well around, reforming industry hiring rules, or, restoring Pell Grants for formerly incarcerated individuals. So I think the more that we can sort of use our voice in, particularly for corporate philanthropy, trying to use our corporate, advocacy and lobbying arms for these policies that don't necessarily address our bottom line per se, but are really critical to advancing our goals. And then to Mark's point, trying to use that platform to bring in, different corporate actors, different partners into those conversations, I think is going to be really important.
Oops. Thank you. Thanks to the three of you. That's fantastic. And this will probably be the last question, I think, from me before I start reading from the chat. So I want to remind people in the audience, now's a good time to start putting your questions in the chat. I want to switch and talk a little bit about data and ask you your thoughts about what needs to happen on the ground to enable more data use by your grantees.
Well, Faith, I'll go first. It'll be my turn. And so one of the things our trustees met 2 weeks ago, and they have funded a second market value analysis that the reinvestment fund does. It's a real estate, as many of you know, tool. This one is going to be different than one that we did, Faith, in 2017 that was funded in part by Invest Health, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation initiative. It's going to be explicitly centered in Black and brown communities. It's going to have a direct organizing element to it and a focus on policy and advocacy. And it's going to be seen as a way to build the next generation of Black and brown and diverse leaders who can work for housing justice over the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think what we need to figure out as places and as folks who do research and care about research is how are we going to link it to real-time issues? How are we going to track it over time? So in a place like Richmond, where we know evictions and structural racism have just had profound negative consequences for communities, how does data set the stage for a conversation? But we've got to work with it so much more deliberately and focused, and make sure that we have all of the actors looking at it and trying to make sense of it at the same time, so that it's not just controlled data by a few policy folks or a few bigger nonprofits or government folks who have that traditional access. So I think the work that Urban has done in democratizing data and really bringing communities into these conversations, I think is a model for us in Richmond. And we're trying internally and through our community just to figure out how we drive deeper and deeper into the long-term policy and power issues that data surfaces.
Great. Anybody else?
It's hard when you're not on an actual panel. You can't just like look and make eyes in the same way as your other panelists. So I'm like kind of looking at Chantal, trying to, I'm happy to just share a few more, but I just want to reiterate, I think, some of the points that Chantal and Mark actually made earlier that I thought were really important here, which is really making sure that the questions and the data sets that are being formulated do reflect the community buy-in and that sort of participatory process. I think that also requires foundations to fund differently, because that takes time and energy and effort and support for these organizations to participate in that. So I think, philanthropy has to give that kind of flexible financing to enable the organizations to be part of those conversations, to have infrastructure to engage, in these, and then have the infrastructure to use the data in a way that's actually useful and can inform their strategy. I also think, to Mark's point, I am really interested in sort of the more real-time data. I'm very struck as we've been going deep in these markets, just how lagging the data has been and how challenging it is. I mean, the world has just been upended in the last year. So the fact that I'm using 2-year-old data is pretty much, in a lot of ways, no longer relevant to the conversations we're trying to have. And so how do we think about new corporate partnerships or new models where we could leverage and get more real-time data? I think will be really important to making sure that the responses that we have are relevant and really addressing the most sort of salient needs to communities today versus maybe the reality 2 years ago. And then finally, again, I think it's the how do we get, I know this has been repetitive, but around the qualitative data and just how do we get that in a way that's manageable, that can be used and actually sort of used to inform strategy, but also to sort of hold accountability sort of at the local level. We just launched a new partnership with CCI, which is really going deep in 6 markets around trying to move beyond affordable housing transactions to really changing housing ecosystems in these markets. And it all starts with data. It's all about sort of bringing together the right partners to understand what are the biggest challenges, how do we make sure we're mirroring the quantitative and the qualitative into a holistic story, but how do we then ensure these organizations have the support to continue that conversation, to use that data over time, to iterate strategies, to refine. I think that's the piece that we still have work to be done on how we actually sort of use that data on an ongoing basis and how do we equip the organizations to do that successfully.
Yeah, you've mentioned accountability several times, and you just have this feeling that in this moment, it's so much more attention to that than perhaps in the past. Funders and companies are making these big pledges, and people are going to want to see what happens. Was it just something that blew through the air for a few months, or is there a lasting commitment? Chantel, did you want to say anything about data before we switch to the chat?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's it's important to, I think, be careful in our use of data, because both, I think, for nonprofits and for philanthropy, because sometimes it is helpful to have more data to help solve a problem. Sometimes it is more helpful to have more data to diagnose a specific issue. We know that issues are different for single, Black mothers than maybe are the same issues for other demographic groups. But we also have seen data and the desire for data used sort of against communities, like, oh, we need more data, when the truth is we sort of know we need to act. And so how do we distinguish between when more data is really helpful and really needed, and when people are just asking for more data because they kind of want to be in paralysis on an issue and not really move forward on it? So I think while some of our partners can definitely leverage more data, there's also needs to be recognition and an acceptance for when folks have been telling you something for a long time, and maybe needing more data isn't really the solution, but action really is.
Yeah, good point. It's such a good point. I'm going to read. There are a lot of questions. So I'll take the 3 of you off the hook, in the sense that all 3 probably don't have to answer each one, just in the spirit of trying to get through all of them before 4 o'clock. So just speak up if you have some thoughts, and you can see the questions too, which helps because some of them are quite long. So I'm going to start with the first one. Are there any new strategies the foundations are using to engage communities in advising or funding or priorities? So any new strategies that you're using to engage communities?
So Faith, I'll take a quick one on that. In 2017, the foundation brought together 18 leaders throughout the Richmond region as strategic advisors. And so that 18 groups of folks actually developed the foundation strategy for the next 5 years. And so we had an open competition, 85 folks applied for 18 positions, and they were selected by external reviewers, because in a place like Richmond, bias is something you always think about and worry about. And then in 2019, we did a similar process for Black and Brown leaders working in the built environment space, because of our concern about the intersections between built environment and health equity. I will tell you, it's been a remarkable turn for our trustees, who essentially ceded power to other folks to determine our agenda item. And on the accountability piece, we brought them together last December, and we produced a scorecard for them every year to show where we're moving. On the qualitative piece with the Black and Brown cohort, we've essentially asked them to tell us what they need from us, so that we are not sort of anticipating or pretending that we know. And so through their voice and through a year's work together and with brighter strategies, they're going to come to our trustees and our team with if you really genuinely want to be in service of our organizations through a health and racial equity lens, this is what you're going to really need to do. And so we can't promise that we do everything overnight, but we do have sort of a 5-year commitment with our trustees to implement the change that our external folks and partners tell us to do.
Mhm. And you're since it just started, I guess you don't know what's coming, because I'm wondering if you're anticipating any surprises.
I'm obviously they're going to want us to use our leverage and resources as a foundation to help them connect with other folks, because as you know, in the South, there aren't necessarily a lot of funders who explicitly want to focus health and racial equity issues. They're going to want to know how they can get better access to folks in City Hall and who make sort of budget and planning decisions. I think they're going to have both capacity needs for their own shop so that they can build long term. And then I think they're going to want for us to listen more with respect to the learning and support they need, because I think we do make a lot of assumptions and we need to sort of just stop and listen and follow differently. So I'm anticipating those sort of as quicker. And of course, they're going to want longer term general operating support. And our board is in that place. I mean, we're going to move almost exclusively to general operating support starting in the fall. And so I don't think that's going to be a point of contention in the least bit.
Great. So I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in. As I said, you don't have to. I can just go on to the next question. So I'll just up to you. All right, I'll go on to the next. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so then Anthony said, Chantel mentioned both an over focus on community deficits, as well as the need for longer term investments for bigger impacts. Is there a contradiction here? Do you worry that the focus on demonstrating impact and using data leads to over-resourcing communities and sectors that already have the capacity to measure and demonstrate impact, or that already have the attention of policymakers?
Faith, I'm so glad you got to this one. If you've seen me like be marginally distracted, it's because I've been mulling over
You're ready.
this question and wanting to like get into talking about it. I think historically, it's certainly been the case that philanthropy, was looking for data, they're looking for measurement. And so they're making investments in places that are best able to measure. I mean, that's certainly been the case. And we've seen that happen in a lot of ways. I don't think it has to be that way. So in our own grant making at Kresge, the thing we try to think about is when we choose to work in a place, it's about need, but it's also about assets. It's just as much of a values judgment and a moral judgment as it is about if there's data availability. I mean, we don't even consider if there's data availability when we choose where we want to work. We're really looking at like, where are their assets? Where is their need? Where are their community partners we can work with? And oftentimes they aren't necessarily as funded in some of the communities if you have a strong value judgment that you would work in. And it's your job to actually build up that capacity and those organizations over time. And then I think, the onus isn't on, it shouldn't necessarily just be on nonprofits or, community groups to show that they're making impact. The onus really has to be on some of these larger capital providers and capital systems and national intermediaries to show that they're actually creating impact. And that doesn't need to be a cost of the community. And then I think in terms of what the impact is, it needs to be on the eye of the beholder, right? Like what do community members actually define as success? And those outcomes might be different than what, philanthropy would think they are. And that's what we have to fund towards. So certainly you can, I think, end up over-focusing on data, over-focusing on if places don't have the data, if they don't have the infrastructure, you don't invest. But I don't think it has to be that way. And I think you can choose places differently, work in places differently, and support the building of that muscle over time.
Great, thank you. Let me ask you a quick question. Is Kresge doing stuff to get those community voices and the community feedback? Because I know that's a tricky thing, because folks may be sort of afraid to give negative feedback, thinking, they could be punished or won't get more money or so forth. And yet, kind of in the new spirit of working with communities, I agree with you. I think it's completely needed, the community assessment of whether this made a difference or not.
Yeah, I mean, for us as members of philanthropy, I think part of it's about the partners that we choose to work with. So when we're funding an organization, in a neighborhood, you can't just be like, oh, we've worked in the neighborhood for a long time, and we're the people who speak on behalf of the neighborhood. It really has to be folks that are constantly, consistently getting feedback, input, changing their decision making based on the views of legacy residents in a neighborhood. And so part of it is about, are we selecting with and working with the right organizations that are doing that work consistently? And then, having the relationship with nonprofits and with community members that makes it clear that, like, we're not going to leave just because something goes wrong, or we're not going to leave just because it takes longer to do something. And to have a relationship that is built on the trust of, we're here for a reason of actually, caring about and loving the community, and we'll be here as long as we need to get the work done. And I think then, people are a lot more open to being critical, to sharing struggles, and then working together to try to take on those challenges together.
Great, thank you. Let me go to the next question, another long one. One of the areas my community partners are unable to find any relevant funding mechanisms for is building community infrastructure for community-led systems of research oversight. For example, community research review boards, and training, staffing, and resources for the research and data use itself. Without community empowerment and investment on this, the power still rests with research institutions. Is that an area any of your foundations are focusing on, or have you seen any movement on this in philanthropy?
I think it's a great point. I'm happy to take this one or kick us off. So I would say, this sort of community-based participatory research field, I think is growing. I actually think more foundations are talking about it. And I think both from sort of a few different ways. One, how do we diversify the research institutions themselves and figure out ways to get them the resources to be closer and spend more time with communities, to get more integrated. The new school under Derek Hamilton leadership has been really thinking about this and has had some really interesting ideas around how to do that. But I think also on the other part of it, which is how do you support the organizations who are in the communities to be part of the data evaluation and research process. And that requires sort of different levels of funding, support for them in maybe a different ways, making sure they have the infrastructure to engage in those conversations. Maybe supporting the tables, to Mark's point. Sometimes philanthropy can support the table that facilitates those dialogues and those conversations, but then also the infrastructure for those organizations to actually continue that work over time. I do think like that is a growing field. I would say by no means do I think it's like everyone's doing it, but I would say it's something we've definitely explored. I know other institutions have as well. We've been learning actually from a lot of local foundations who I think have been at the forefront of this. I think groups like Mark, who have been sort of thinking about this, like we at the national level are trying to learn how do we replicate that as we're trying to go deeper in communities. I would say community foundations have been another one just in general who have been, exploring this and pushing the boundaries of it. So my initial sort of thoughts on places to go would be like starting the conversation with the community foundations, with some of those local funder collaboratives, because I do think this is a topic where more foundations are seeing the gaps, but might be looking for sort of support or ideas on sort of how to move it forward. So the fact that this group has ideas, I think could really be interesting partners in those conversations.
Good, thank you. Anybody else on this point?
I think I would just say this is something that I think is really important and would be really attractive to a lot of the funders that we work with. We've seen for a long time that for all there are great things and great power in larger research institutions, and then there are also pieces of community wisdom and insight that are lost in that approach. So the more ideas that people have for this kind of community level kind of oversight work, and the more that funders can fund that work is awesome. And then the question becomes, how do national organizations actually work in support of that, and how do they shift their practices based on what's learned from those boards? So I think this is a really important emerging field, and we want to do more of that.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next question. From an evaluation standpoint, and noting Colleen's comment about end of grant cycle reporting, what is the perspective of philanthropic entities engaging in formative evaluation processes with course corrections for funded community initiatives? And then she has formative use of existing data.
So Susan, on this one, with the larger initiatives that we do both formative and summative evaluation. So we just will hire external folks to make sure they check in with the larger bodies of work and the partners engaged in that. And we're quite open to making sort of mid-course corrections, and we try to all the time. With the CDC Foundation work that we're doing right now, we've engaged someone who helped us listen to all the partners that are in part of the process, listen to about 50 other stakeholders in our community to sort of get a better handle on what they're thinking in response to the pandemic and Hispanic populations. I think the challenge on this one is a lot of funders, small funders and particularly, just don't have a lot of money in their budget to support formative and summative evaluation work. And so, and I like what Colleen said around community foundations. I found in my career in philanthropy that community foundations are often the best situated to do some of the work, both around participatory design and engagement and evaluation work, because they have other donors that they can go to. I think actually this is a practice that philanthropy needs to change, but frame it much more in terms of learning and in terms of adaptive capacity rather than anything that is punitive or is used to wave the finger at a partner that we don't think is doing the work that we want them to do.
I totally agree. I think part of what, the evolution, I would say this is something we spend a lot of time grappling with, to be totally candid. I mean, we're in a corporate, you can imagine the kind of requests we get around impact and data. And I think, we're trying to balance maybe those requests with, again, getting back to what is the data being used for, and moving away from using it as a tool around accountability, because we don't necessarily see that as the best, but instead using it more around learning to inform, decision-making strategy, or, in some cases it might be that this is really formative for like a proof of concept for policymakers. And then that might require a different type of evaluation that we know is going to be necessary to inform those stakeholders. So trying to be really intentional on the onset with the partners. I think getting back to Chantel's point, like what are the metrics that they see are valuable to measuring the success of this program, trying to understand how are we collectively trying to use that data to advance our shared strategy. And then that might determine what type of data is necessary and the rigor in which we need to collect it to influence maybe those end goals that we've set.
Yeah, and I am not the I'm not the favorite of the PhDs in my organization, probably for a reason. But I'll say that formative evaluation is really important. It needs to be done. I think, as Mark points out, it's something that the field has a lot of opportunity to expand. But what's even cooler than needing to course correct after evaluation is doing enough community engagement and on the front end, and enough diligence and discussion and work with the communities that you're serving, that the program design and the strategy is actually more effective at the outset, so those course corrections are less necessary. So one of the things we think about is how do we balance funding for evaluation with funding to do the upfront work of actually designing and planning processes that will get you to a place that reduces the need for course correction.
Thank you. And we'll make this the last comment/question. I love that the concept of power and turning power over to communities is coming up a lot. I'm wondering if any of you are having conversations around reparations or cash transfers, or conversations about balancing project funding or identifying community leaders to fund and simply ensuring all community members have money or resources for needs. Anybody working on any of this?
Well, we're not. So we are focused for the first time explicitly on the intersection of health and wealth. And so this will be in the next sort of new move for the foundation. And we've been able to get into this space because of the great sort of data around the intersection of EITC and health equity. So we will enter these waters through that. The guaranteed income pilot creates an opportunity to begin to have different conversations around transfers in place. And so we're part of the national effort, the mayor's national effort around guaranteed income. I have not in our region heard much around reparations. I know that in Asheville, I think the Community Foundation in Asheville has begun to have those conversations. I don't know of other Southern sites that have, Faith. And on the grant balancing of project funding and community leaders, and I'm not sure this is answering the question that was asked, we are looking very hard at sort of how we fund and who we fund. And so our traditional white-led organizations that have received disproportionate funding from the foundation, we're going to change our processes so that we really begin to invest our assets more equitably in through our grant making strategies. But I'm not sure that's the question. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, we've been supporting some unconditional cash transfer work on both kind of pilots in specific communities, and then also the Economic Security Project, the group of community of practice of folks who are doing that work, and trying to figure out, how does unconditional cash transfer create opportunities for social and economic mobility. We're also looking at other strategies of community wealth building. So neighborhood investment trusts where community members actually can own a stake in equitable development that's happening in the neighborhood, in neighborhoods that are changing. In terms of direct capital support, so I think Mark mentioned, the shift from project to support to general operating support. One of the things that we've been doing in Detroit for a while as a part of our Kresge Artists in Detroit program is just providing direct fellowship dollars to artists in the community with no expectation for what they will do with the dollars. If they, would like to use it to eat, great. And so we've been thinking more about how to apply that kind of non-directed funding that we do in the artist community to other types of activists and leaders in other communities.
Great, thank you. Leah, it looks like we have 1 minute left. Do you want to make any comments before we close out?
Only to thank our panelists today. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad that you agreed to join us and to share your thoughts with our network. So I hope everybody will join me in a virtual clap to thank you all for your time.
Great panel. I really enjoyed talking to you and learned a ton. I hope other people learned as much as I did.
Yes, thank you, Faith. And with 1 minute left, we'll sign off. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
It was a great way to end an IP month.